in any conflict. Your fate will depend on your actions. War crimes will be prosecuted. War criminals will be punished. And it will be no defense to say, I was just following orders.
What I'm going to do in looking at human security in Iraq is to go back to the issue of international law that we've heard quite a lot about and talk about some of the inadequacies and gaps of international law. As we heard way back on the first morning, international law, of course, was the framework that was violated with respect to the unilateral invasion, occupation of Iraq, and we also had some rundown of the history of the United Nations prohibition of the use of force. But, and I think it's really important to remember this, the United Nations is, of course, an organization of states, and it's states' interests that are primary within the Charter and within the organization. So the concept of international peace and security under international law has always classically been understood narrowly as protecting the political and physical integrity of sovereign states. And so in its traditional form, state security is centered on the preservation of the sovereign state from external threats, requiring internationally recognized boundaries, protected when deemed necessary by military action, prohibition of the use of force between states, non-intervention in the affairs of other states, and the right of self-defense to threats to that state security. I think it was put extremely well by Walden Bellow on the very first day when he quoted Tony Blair as saying that the interest of the British government is to protect the interests of the United Kingdom, protect the power, I think that was the word that he used, of the United Kingdom. The notion of power encapsulating essentially the concept of political integrity, political independence of the state, and one might also add the way in which states such as the UK extend that notion of interest to economic interest and the right to defend their economic interests that we saw as far back as, for example, as in the Suez Campaign in 1956, protect the rights of the Suez Canal Company. However, since the end of the Cold War, the Security Council has, to some extent, moved beyond this narrow understanding of state security in its interpretation of international peace and security, which, of course, under the Charter, it's given the primary responsibility to protect, and has authorized collective military intervention as a response to threats to international peace and security in such situations as the humanitarian crisis in Somalia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, in response to internal armed conflict in places such as Haiti and Sierra Leone, and also in response to refugee flows, again, for example, in Haiti. But I think it's also worth noting that even when it moves beyond the sort of state security paradigm in authorizing response, its response is still thought of in military collective terms. It's the militarization that we heard about earlier. It has, in other resolutions, moved somewhat wider. For example, it's talked about the issues of insecurity faced by children, faced by women in Resolution 1325 we heard about this morning, and the insecurities caused by HIV/AIDS. But such resolutions are not under Chapter 7, are therefore not important, and are more widely disregarded. The state-centered concept of security, upon which international peace and security is based, also extends to the assumption that it's states that challenge that security. And this means, for example, that very little attention has been paid by international law to the ways in which non-state actors, such as multinational corporations, also threaten international peace and security in their pursuit of global profit. However, in the context of terrorism, this has now changed, so that in Resolution 1368, the Security Council recognised terrorist acts as constituting a threat to international peace and security, and went further and accepted that the United States could use force in self-defence as a response to the terrorist attacks of the previous day. The resolution was adopted on 12th September 2001. But the fact that it is self-defence as the only charter-based justification for unilateral use of force means that states consistently manipulate international law to argue that their uses of force fall either within self-defence or fall within the terms of either a current, or in the case of Iraq, a revived Security Council resolution. And such manipulation of international law, of course, does not redress security, but generates further insecurity. But then, not content with gaining the Security Council recognition of terrorist acts as a threat to international peace and security, and its authorization of self-defense in response to such attacks, the United States has also then sought to redefine state security more broadly. So, in the context of terrorist attacks and the possession or presumed possession of weapons of mass destruction, it's argued that the protection of a state's own borders is not sufficient, and that preemptive strike against another state within that state's borders is what is required. That state is conveniently labelled a rogue state, a failed state, an axis of evil state, and of course that state then loses its right to self-defence. But what is strikingly missing, I might just add that this is a highly controversial claim that's widely discounted by international lawyers, the claim of preemptive self-defence. But what is missing from this concept of international peace and security as through a state-centred paradigm is any notion of human or personal security. And yet the evidence that we have heard so movingly over the last 2 days makes it absolutely clear that it is human security that is at the very core of the issues with respect to Iraq. And so it seems that international law must reconfigure itself so as to incorporate within it more clearly a priority and a preeminent position to be given to human security. A number of bodies have given us an analysis of what constitutes human security. The Commission on Human Security report of May 2005, for example, defines the objective of human security as being, quote, to protect the vital core of all human lives in ways that enhance human freedoms and fulfillment. Human security denotes individual freedom from basic insecurities, whatever that root of that security, and I think wherever the people who are living. I think human security is something that affects people all the way around the world today. It's essentially a public order social issue, for insecurity is generated, not redressed, by military conflict between states. So again, the uncertainties of the international legal regime for the prohibition of the use of force and its contested unilateral use in Iraq in 2003 are themselves causes of insecurity. Human insecurity is also caused by internal conflict, by collapse or destruction of state institutions and structures, by authoritarian and violent state regimes, by human rights violations by state agents and by non-state agents, by environmental degradation. It emanates also from violence and abuse by non-state actors. For example, the fear of experiencing terrorist attacks, by being caught in the crossfire, as we saw yesterday, by being targeted by non-state groups, whether they are paramilitary forces, whether they are resistance forces, or whether they are criminal gangs, such as we find in many forms of conflict today. Human insecurity is also caused by discrimination and by denial of economic and social rights, such as the denial of the right to food, inadequate health care, inadequate, dirty, soiled, non-appropriate water, housing, destruction of housing and shelter, poverty, in a word, and the unemployment that follows so often in these situations, leading to poverty, leading to vulnerability to prostitution and other forms of human insecurity. But although denial of human rights contributes to human insecurity, and human insecurity generates itself further violations of human rights, human insecurity is a wider concept than human rights. Human security encompasses physical security, economic security, legal security, political security, food security, emotional security, gender security, relational security, and I'm quite sure that you can all think of many others. It's about protecting people who experience threats and strengthening and supporting people against those threats. It's not about generating insecurity by raising fears within the population that then leads to acceptance of oppressive action in response, nor is it about degrading and humiliating people within states. It's perhaps summarized best by the inclusion of freedom from fear and freedom from want in President Roosevelt's famous Second World War speech. The report of May 2005 also added that it includes freedom to take action on one's own behalf, that is the enjoyment of autonomy and self-esteem. So human security clearly goes beyond state security, and I'm arguing should be seen as part of international peace and security. It is people-centered, and it addresses insecurities that are not typically recognized as state security threats. Now, I think an important aspect of human security that we need to think about is the way in which human security operates in the situations of the use of force when one state uses force against another. The right to human security of individuals in the target state may well be at odds with the national security and human security demands of the perpetrator state. So, for example, in the war against terror, the United States played upon, generated, kept at the top of the agenda human insecurity fears of people within the United States, same thing within the United Kingdom, to justify causing human insecurity for those within the target state. And so we have, for example, the argument from the United States that in response to terrorist attacks, it may destroy those who are deemed to be sheltering or harboring terrorists, Afghanistan, or those who are thought to have failed to disarm, as in the case of Iraq. Proportionality tends to go out of the window. And we also have, for example, the case of Israel and the security wall that we talked about this morning, where, again, the claims that of Israeli national security were said to justify the building of the wall despite the economic, social, political deprivations, insecurities that caused in major ways to many Palestinians. The fact that the International Court of Justice rejected the Israeli case is perhaps some indication of a move in this way by the international law. What is quite clear is that human insecurities cannot be balanced against each other, so that, or not balanced, cannot be played off against each other, so that, for example, the right of any state to protect its own individuals cannot extend to the right then to destroy the lives, the human security of individuals in other states. There is no hierarchy in human security. All individuals have that right to human security. So while the war against terror, so-called, is supposedly about human security, its pursuance through war rather than through criminal justice methods, for example, has been deeply destabilizing for all those in the various target states. I can't read my own writing. Right, further, by combining the war against terror with the more conventional war in the case of Iraq, further destabilization and insecurity is caused by then the potential labeling of anyone who disagrees as terrorists and then becoming subject to the oppressive regimes, whether in Iraq or back at home in the US or the UK, as we've been hearing, which then constitutes still further human insecurity. I'd like to add an additional word about legal insecurity. Legal insecurity is created where there is violation of the rule of law, lack of accountability, and impunity. One might notice in the context of Iraq, this works at 3 levels. Iraqis, as we heard yesterday, under Order 17, cannot access Iraqi courts when their claims are against essentially the internationals, the multinational force, the contractors, and so on. The order giving immunity from the CPA that has been carried into effect. Iraqi civilians also have very great difficulties accessing courts in, for example, the United States or the United Kingdom to bring claims there. There are some cases, very innovative points of law are being fought, but obviously the obstacles, not least the expense, the access, etc., and the drain of doing such cases are immense. The third level is the lack of international accountability and the impunity that that generates for the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, I don't need to go through the numerous ways in which human insecurity has been generated in Iraq. We have seen this, heard it, felt it for the last 2 days. I'll just make a few comments and then conclude. I think what we see very clearly in the context of Iraq is that a situation where the so-called protectors, those who are supposed to establish human security, live in bunkers, are heavily armed, and whose only contact with the civilian population is through military action, aggression, roadblocks, road checks, etc., clearly promotes human insecurity. But what follows from that is that it's the foreign military presence in Iraq that has become normalized. It's become legitimated within the sending states as necessary to provide protection for their human security. And in Iraq itself, the security concerns of the internationals becomes more at a higher premium than those of the Iraqis. Violence itself has become normalized. Indeed, it's civilian lives that have somehow become seen as deviant and therefore worthy of being attacked, challenged. They're seen as deviant either because they are seen as terrorists, or perhaps they live close, civilians live close to an area that's seen as a terrorist stronghold or a target town, as in Fallujah yesterday, or because they are carrying out their normal civilian lives, trying to keep some hold on some form of normality, going to religious worship. We heard a moment ago of attacks of people attending mosques, attending weddings or funerals, firing guns into the air, action that is perceived as deviant by the foreign military force, and therefore completely undermining traditional international law notions around protector and protected, war, peace, occupation, end of war, intervention, non-intervention. All of these terms cease to have any meaning at all. Some people, of course, suffer particular forms of human insecurity. We've heard about the particular position of women and how gender insecurity, gender relations are used and become symbolic in both sides so that women get squashed and suffer greater forms of insecurity through this. Other of the most vulnerable members of society, refugees, the elderly, children, those who are disabled. Might also notice in passing on this point that the United States is the only country in the world that is not a party to either the Children's Convention or the Women's Convention, and so therefore does not commit itself to the provisions in the Children and Women's Conventions. To finish, states respond to national security issues, as we all know, through military defense solutions. They increase their arms spending, they increase their military capabilities, and they think in terms of military responses. What Iraq has shown absolutely clearly is that military responses are not appropriate to protect human security. The Commission on Human Rights Human Security report recommended different responses to human insecurity, and it favoured protection and empowerment. Protection requires focus on public safety, not military operations, and, to quote, a concerted effort to develop norms, processes, and institutions that systematically address insecurity, while empowerment enables people to develop their potential and become full participants in decision-making, self-determination, not elections under an occupation. And then we might just think back to March 2003. Human insecurity in the United States and the UK, generated by the government, by such claims as we heard the other day of the 45 minutes to attack notion, could have been addressed through accurate intelligence, accurate reporting of that intelligence, by continuation of the weapons inspectorate and an honest reception of what the weapons inspectors were saying, rather than a willingness to deny even before they had completed their reports. Human insecurity in Iraq, which of course had existed from certainly throughout the Saddam regime, through its war policies, through its denial of human rights, could also have been addressed through, most importantly, the lifting of economic sanctions, clearly a major basis for human insecurity in Iraq, perhaps by introducing human rights monitors and again taking a more focused human rights approach. So what I would do is to ask the jury if, when they are considering the international law framework that is applicable, to, in the spirit of the high-level panel for UN reform, which wants discussion around the authorization and the use of force, to think about how human security can be put at the center of that, so that we have a human-oriented international law rather than a solely state-centered international law.
I'd just like to ask, when the US military conducts operations of collective punishment now, in the minds of the Iraqi people, how complicit is this supposedly democratic government that's in place now? Is it seen as part of the system of command or not?
There were reports
They haven't got.
after the April assault, the first assault in Fallujah, that the targeting of a particular hospital and the medical personnel in the second assault was a response to the information given to the media by some doctors in the hospital in Fallujah. I don't know whether there's any truth in this allegation that there was a deliberate attempt to target hospital personnel in the second assault on Fallujah in November because doctors from that particular hospital had given information to the media about the killings that took place in the first assault in April. Is that true?
First of all, in the first place, the hospital was targeted and the medical personnel was targeted, and to such an extent that some of them lost consciousness for many days, and for 3 weeks the hospital was evacuated. The patients were taken outdoors, and for 2.5 months the Americans settled down there, not only in this hospital but in other hospitals as well. In Fallujah they were targeted as well. There were missile and mortar bombs and attacks against these, and it was reported that many physicians died here. There was another hospital which was rocketed, and the patients coming to this hospital as well as centers for medication were targeted. The very center of Fallujah was the target of rocket fire. And certain neighborhoods were bombed where there were health centers, and they knew very well that Fallujah had important problems health-wise, and that's why they attacked the hospital first and foremost. They kept the ambulances from moving around, the dispensaries, the health centers. and the medical personnel were deliberately targeted. It's true. Now, the question as to whether Fallujah was targeted because it's majoritarily Sunnite, no. From the onset of the occupation, I know very well that Fallujah was the very first city where the Iraqi resistance began, and it began very early there. And this is why the international public opinion first heard of Fallujah. In a few days, the name of Fallujah was heard everywhere. And the first uprising of civilians took place here. There were some pacifist demonstrations, and they voiced their demands. In the neighborhood of Zai, in a school, there is a U.S. headquarters, and even the children approaching the school were shot at. What are Americans doing in a settlement? They get on the roofs of houses and they keep filming civilians. And at the same time, they believe that they are in control. And then they use certain special eyeglasses which allow them to see women without clothes was a rumor that started going around. And since people are very keen on honor issues in Fallujah, this created great disturbance. And then there were killings carried out by the Americans during this first demonstration. And then there were other demonstrations, and during those there were killings as well. People without any defense were killed. And of course, an uprising and resistance began in Fallujah.
Ehline helaldir ha ehle haram. Biz içeriz bize yoktur vebali. Ehline helaldir ha ehle haram. Biz içeriz bize yoktur vebali. Sevaba